I'm Zoe, and I thought coming home meant closure, respect, maybe even forgiveness. Instead, standing beside my father's casket while my brother Marcus told everyone I was a disappointment who'd amounted to nothing, I realized some wounds never heal, they just get buried under years of silence. But when Agent Victoria Kane stepped forward and said those 4 words that changed everything, I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't planned. It's simply living the truth they never bothered to discover. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. One Ram, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October rain drummed against the windshield of my rented sedan as I pulled into the gravel parking lot of St. Michael's Cathedral. Millfield, Pennsylvania looked exactly as I'd left it 5 years ago, frozen in time like a snow globe someone had forgotten to shake. The church's stone facade loomed gray against the overcast sky, its stained glass windows dulled by the persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into everything in this old steel town. I sat in the car for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, watching people in black coats hurry toward the church entrance. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles white against the leather. Through the passenger window I could see familiar faces from my childhood, neighbors who used to wave from their porches when I walked to school, now older, more weathered, carrying umbrellas and tissues. The last time I'd been in Millfield was for my college graduation. Dad had sat in the back row, arms crossed, while Marcus made snide comments about my criminal justice degree being a waste of time. "What's she gonna do? Arrest people for parking tickets?" He'd laughed, loud enough for half the auditorium to hear, and them had shushed him, but weakly, without conviction. That was 5 years ago, and in those 5 years I'd spoken to my family exactly 17 times. I'd counted. I pulled my phone from my purse, checking the screen one more time. 3 missed calls from Mom, 2 from Marcus, all from yesterday after they'd finally tracked down my work number to tell me Dad had passed. A heart attack at the auto shop, quick and sudden, just the way he would have wanted it. The funeral director had been understanding when I'd called to arrange flying in from Philadelphia, professional and kind in the way that people in that line of work learn to be. The rain was letting up slightly, turning from a steady downpour to a fine mist that clung to everything like grief itself. I grabbed my black umbrella from the back seat and stepped out onto the wet gravel, my heels clicking against the stones as I made my way toward the church. The familiar smell of Millfield hit me immediately, a mixture of rain, old metal from the defunct steel plant, and the faint sweetness of the maple trees that lined Main Street. Inside the church, the warm air was thick with the scent of lilies and old wood polish. Soft organ music drifted from the speakers, something classical that Dad would have hated. He'd been more of a classic rock guy, the kind who'd turn up Led Zeppelin while working on engines and sing along badly to Stairway to Heaven. The church was fuller than I'd expected, probably 200 people scattered across the wooden pews, their quiet conversations creating a low hum that mixed with the music. I slipped into a pew near the back, hoping to avoid attention until I was ready for it. From where I sat, I could see the closed casket at the front of the church, draped in a spray of white roses that Mom must have chosen. She'd always loved white roses, said they meant new beginnings, though I wasn't sure what kind of new beginning you could have at a funeral. Marcus stood near the front, accepting condolences with the practiced ease of someone who'd always been comfortable being the center of attention. He looked good, I had to admit. The years had been kind to him in the way they often are to men who never questioned their place in the world. His dark suit was well tailored, his hair still thick and styled with just enough gray at the temples to make him look distinguished rather than old. He'd inherited Dad's broad shoulders and easy smile, the kind of natural charisma that had always made people gravitate toward him. Mom sat in the front pew, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, her once vibrant auburn hair now mostly silver and pulled back in a simple bun. Miss Patterson from next door sat beside her, one arm around Mom's shoulders, whispering what I assumed were words of comfort. I recognized most of the faces in the crowd: Mr. Kowalski from the corner grocery store, his wife Helen beside him, the Maloney family from 3 streets over, all 5 kids now grown with children of their own. Father McKenna, who'd been at St. Michael's since before I was born, stood near the altar speaking quietly with the funeral director. These were the people who'd watched me grow up, who'd known me when I was just Bobby Harper's youngest daughter, the quiet one who always had her nose in a book. The service began with Father McKenna's gentle voice filling the space, talking about eternal rest and the hope of resurrection. He spoke about Dad's 43 years in Millfield, his dedication to his family and his business, his love of fishing and terrible jokes. It was a nice eulogy, the kind that painted Dad in warm golden tones, that softened the harder edges of reality. When Father McKenna asked if anyone wanted to share memories, Marcus was the first to stand. He walked to the podium with confident steps, straightening his tie as he reached the microphone. The church fell silent, except for the soft sound of Mom's quiet crying. "My father," Marcus began, his voice carrying easily through the space, was the kind of man who believed in hard work, family loyalty, and taking care of your own. He paused, looking out over the congregation with the kind of measured pause that suggested he'd rehearsed. He built Harper's Auto Repair from nothing, worked 16-hour days to make sure we had everything we needed. He taught me that a man's worth isn't measured by fancy degrees or big city jobs, but by his dedication to the people who matter. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as Marcus continued, his words carrying an undercurrent that felt aimed directly at me. "Dad was disappointed sometimes," Marcus said, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found mine. "Disappointed when people he'd sacrificed for turned their backs on family, chose careers over the people who raised them. He used to say that education was supposed to make you better, not make you think you were better than where you came from." The words hit like a physical blow. I could feel eyes turning toward me, people in the congregation putting together the pieces, realizing that Marcus was talking about his sister, the one who'd left for college and never really came back. My cheeks burned, but I kept my expression neutral, the way I'd learned to do during long interrogations and hostile depositions. "Some people," Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength, "think that success means abandoning your roots, forgetting the people who loved you first. They chase fancy careers in big cities, too busy to come home for Christmas, too important to help when family needs them. Dad never understood that kind of selfishness, and neither do I." The church was completely silent now except for Marcus's voice and the sound of rain beginning to pick up again outside. I wanted to stand up, to walk out, to escape the collective gaze of 200 people who were now looking at me like I was something distasteful that had wandered in from the rain. But leaving would only confirm what Marcus was saying, would only prove his point about my selfishness and lack of family loyalty. "My sister Zoe is here today," Marcus said, gesturing toward me with a movement that seemed casual but felt deliberate. "She finally found time in her busy schedule to come home. I'm sure Dad would appreciate that she could fit us in." The words were delivered with a smile, the kind of smile that looked warm and loving to anyone who didn't know better. But I could see the coldness in his eyes, the satisfaction he took in this public humiliation. This wasn't grief talking. This was Marcus being exactly who he'd always been, just with a bigger audience. "Dad always said family was supposed to come first," Marcus continued, his voice now carrying a note of sadness that sounded genuine enough to fool most of the people listening. "He never understood why some people thought they were too good for the life he'd worked so hard to build. He died hoping that maybe someday, his daughter would remember that family isn't something you leave behind when you find something better." I felt tears stinging my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage, of frustration, of the helpless fury that comes from being attacked in a place and time where you can't defend yourself. Marcus knew exactly what he was doing. He was using Dad's funeral as a platform to humiliate me, to paint me as the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned her family for selfish ambition. When Marcus finished speaking, he walked back to his seat with the same confident stride, accepting murmured condolences and supportive pats on the shoulder from people who thought they'd just heard a touching tribute to family value. Father McKenna asked if anyone else wanted to speak, but the church remained silent. What was there to say after that? The rest of the service passed in a blur of hymns and prayers and final blessing. I sat frozen in my pew, feeling like every eye in the church was on me, feeling the weight of their judgment and their pity for poor Bobby Harper who'd died without seeing his daughter amount to anything worthwhile. When the pallbearers carried the casket down the aisle, I caught a glimpse of Marcus's face as he passed. He looked satisfied, like a job well done. The burial at Millfield Cemetery was mercifully brief. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soft and muddy, making the walk from the parking area to the gravesite treacherous in heels. I hung back from the main group, standing near a large oak tree about 20 feet away from where they'd lowered Dad's casket into the ground. From there I could see everything but didn't have to endure the continued stares and whispered comments. After Father McKenna said the final prayers, people began to disperse. Some headed back to their cars, others clustered in small groups sharing memories and making plans for the reception at the church hall. I was about to head back to my car when I heard footsteps on the wet grass behind me. Zoe Harper. I turned to see a woman approaching, probably in her mid-40s with short blonde hair and sharp intelligent eyes. She was wearing a well-cut black suit that looked expensive, and there was something about the way she carried herself that screamed federal law enforcement. I'd worked with enough agents to recognize the type. Agent Victoria Kane, she said, extending her hand. FBI Financial Crimes Division, Philadelphia Field Office. My heart started beating fast. Victoria Kane wasn't just any FBI agent. She was my supervisor's supervisor, the assistant director who oversaw all major financial crime investigations in the region. I'd seen her in briefings and departmental meetings, but we'd never been formally introduced. She was legendary in the bureau, known for taking down some of the most sophisticated financial criminal organizations on the East Coast. Agent Kane, I managed, shaking her hand. What are you doing here? I grew up in Millfield, she said simply. Bobby Harper fixed my family's cars for 20 years. When I heard he'd passed, I wanted to pay my respects. She paused, looking toward the small crowd still gathered around the gravesite. I couldn't help but overhear some of what was said during the service. My cheeks burned again. I'm sorry you had to witness that. Family dynamics can be complicated. Agent Kane studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable. How long have you been with the Bureau, Agent Harper? 3 years with financial crimes. 5 years total, counting training and my previous assignment in cybercrime. And before that, summa cum laude, from Penn State. Criminal justice major with a minor in accounting, top 10% at Quantica. The words came out automatically, like a resume recitation, but I felt strange saying them here in the cemetery where I'd just been publicly humiliated for my career choices. Agent Kane nodded slowly. I've been reviewing the Morrison case file, the wire fraud investigation you led last year that took down that investment scheme. Impressive work. I felt a flutter of something that might have been pride. The Morrison case had been my first major lead investigation, a complex financial fraud that had taken 8 months to untangle and had resulted in the recovery of $12 million in stolen retirement funds. It had been the kind of case that could make a career, and I'd handled it from start to finish. Thank you, I said. It was a team effort. Modest too, Agent Kane said with a slight smile. I also reviewed your work on the Chen trafficking investigation. The financial analysis you did helped us understand how they were moving money through shell companies. That analysis was instrumental in the conviction. The Chen case had been even more complex, involving international money transfers and cryptocurrency transactions that had taken me weeks to decode. It had been the kind of work that required not just technical skill, but creative thinking. The ability to see patterns that others miss. I was just doing my job, I said, but I could feel some of the tension from the funeral service starting to ease. It felt good to be reminded that I was good at something, that the career Marcus had dismissed so publicly was actually meaningful and important. Agent Harper, Agent Kane said, her voice taking on a more formal tone. I want you to know that your work hasn't gone unnoticed. The Financial Crimes Division has been watching your progress, and we're impressed, very impressed. Before I could respond, I heard voices getting louder near the gravesite. Marcus was standing with a group of Dad's friends from the auto repair shop, his voice carrying across the cemetery. It's just sad, you know, he was saying. Dad always hoped she'd come back home, maybe help with the business, be part of the family. Instead, she's off playing cop in Philadelphia, too important to visit, too busy to call. What does she do exactly? Asked Mr. Kowalski. Marcus shrugged. Some kind of government job. Paper pushing, probably. She acts like it's important, but honestly, how hard can it be? She's not exactly changing the world. I felt my jaw clench, but Agent Kane placed a gentle hand on my arm. May I? She asked, nodding toward the group. Before I could answer, she was walking across the wet grass toward Marcus and his audience. I followed, my heart pounding, not sure what was about to happen but sensing that it was going to be significant. Excuse me, Agent Kane said, as she approached the group. Her voice was pleasant but carried an authority that made everyone turn toward her immediately. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation about Zoe Harper. Marcus looked confused for a moment, trying to place this well-dressed stranger, who'd just interrupted his character assassination session. I'm sorry, do we know you? Agent Victoria Kane, FBI, she said, producing her badge and credentials with a smooth, practiced motion. Assistant Director, Financial Crimes Division. The effect was immediate. Mr. Kowalski's eyes widened. Mrs. Patterson, who'd wandered over with Mom, let out a small gasp. Marcus's confident expression faltered for just a moment before he tried to recover. Oh, he said, forcing a smile. Well, nice to meet you. I was just telling everyone about my sister's career. Yes, I heard, Agent Kane said, pleasantly. You mentioned that she's not exactly changing the world with her government job. I thought you might be interested to know exactly what Agent Harper does for the FBI. The group had grown larger now. More people from the funeral had noticed the commotion, and were drifting over, drawn by the sight of an FBI agent at Bobby Harper's burial. I could see Mom pushing through the small crowd, her face pale and confused. Agent Harper, Agent Kane continued, her voice carrying easily across the cemetery, leads some of our most complex financial crime investigations. Last year alone, her work resulted in the recovery of over $30 million in stolen assets, and the conviction of 14 individuals involved in fraud schemes that targeted elderly and vulnerable victims. I could feel the shift in the crowd's attention, the way people were now looking at me with surprise and something that might have been respect. Marcus's face had gone slightly pale, but he was trying to maintain his dismissive attitude. That's great, he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. I'm sure it's important work. It is, Agent Kane said, firmly. Agent Harper is one of our top investigators. She's currently leading the task force, investigating a multi-state investment fraud that's stolen over $100 million from pension funds. Her financial analysis skills are so highly regarded that other agencies regularly request her consultation on complex cases. The cemetery had grown quiet except for Agent Kane's voice, and the sound of wind rustling through the oak trees. Even the funeral director, who'd been packing up his equipment, had stopped to listen. In fact, Agent Kane continued, Agent Harper's work has been so exemplary that she's being considered for promotion to supervisory special agent. At 32, she would be one of the youngest agents in bureau history to reach that level in financial crime. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. This was news to me. I had no idea I was being considered for promotion. I'd been so focused on my current cases that I hadn't even thought about advancement opportunity. Marcus was staring at me now, his earlier smugness replaced by something that looked like shock. The man who'd just spent 10 minutes publicly humiliating me for my career choices was learning that those choices had led to exactly the kind of success and recognition he'd always craved for himself. She's also, Agent Kane added, her voice taking on a note of pride, one of the most respected agents in our division. Her colleagues consider her brilliant, dedicated, and absolutely essential to some of our most important work. In short, Agent Harper isn't just changing the world, she's actively making it safer for families like yours. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see people in the crowd reassessing everything they thought they knew about me, everything Marcus had just told them. Miss Patterson was looking at me with something approaching awe. Mr. Kowalski was nodding slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. Mom pushed through to the front of the group, her eyes wide and confused. "Zoe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "is this true?" I looked at my mother, this woman who'd raised me but had never really seen me, who'd sat quietly while Marcus dismissed my achievements and questioned my work. For 3 years, I'd been protecting vulnerable people from sophisticated criminals, using skills I'd worked hard to develop, making a difference in ways that mattered, and my own family had never bothered to ask what I actually did for a living. "Yes, Mom," I said quietly. "It's true." Agent Kane stepped closer to me, her expression serious but warm. "Agent Harper is not just an asset to the FBI. She's exactly the kind of agent we build our reputation on. Her work speaks for itself, and frankly, we're lucky to have her." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus was staring at the ground now, his face flushed red. The man who'd spent the last hour painting me as a selfish disappointment was confronted with the reality that I'd achieved exactly the kind of professional success and recognition that he'd always wanted for himself. His auto repair shop, successful as it was in Millfield, suddenly seemed very small in comparison to leading federal investigations that recovered millions of dollars and protected thousands of victims. "I had no idea," Mom said, looking back and forth between me and Agent Kane. "Zoe never told us. We knew she worked for the government. But Agent Harper is humble about her accomplishments," Agent Kane said, "but her work has literally changed lives. The investment fraud case she solved last year, that recovered retirement savings for over 300 families who'd lost everything to criminals. The trafficking investigation she helped crack, that shut down an operation that was exploiting vulnerable women and children." I felt tears stinging my eyes again, but this time they were different. For 5 years I'd absorbed my family's disappointment and judgment, had wondered sometimes if maybe they were right, if maybe I had chosen my career over family loyalty. But standing here in the cemetery where I'd just been publicly humiliated, listening to one of the most respected agents in the FBI describe my work and its impact, I realized that I'd been fighting the wrong battle. I hadn't abandoned my family by choosing my career. I'd found my real calling, my real purpose, and I'd excelled at it in ways that my family had never bothered to understand or acknowledge. The problem wasn't that I'd failed to live up to their expectations. The problem was that their expectations had been too small to contain who I'd actually become. Agent Kane turned to address the entire group, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding attention in high-stakes situations. "I want you all to know that Agent Harper represents the very best of law enforcement. She's the kind of person who makes our communities safer, who stands between vulnerable people and those who would exploit them. Her father should have been incredibly proud of the woman she's become." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He looked up from the ground, his face a mixture of embarrassment and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. For the first time since I'd arrived in Millfield, he seemed to realize that maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong about me. "I think," Agent Kane said, looking directly at Marcus, "there might have been some misunderstanding about what Agent Harper does for a living. It's not paper pushing or playing cop. It's serious, important work that requires exceptional skill, dedication, and intelligence. The kind of work that makes a real difference in the world." The crowd began to disperse slowly, people walking back toward their cars with quiet conversations and sideways glances in my direction. I could hear fragments of their discussions as they passed. FBI agent, millions of dollars, youngest supervisor in history. The narrative about Bobby Harper's disappointing daughter was being rewritten in real time. Mom lingered near the gravesite, looking lost and confused. She approached me hesitantly, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to speak to me after everything that had happened. "Zoe," she said softly, "I'm sorry, I had no idea about your work, about how important it is. You never told us. You never asked." "Mom," I said gently, "when I called, you always wanted to talk about Marcus's business, or your church activities or Dad's health. When I tried to mention work, you'd change the subject or say you didn't understand government jobs." Mom's face crumpled slightly. I thought you were just filing papers or something. I didn't know you were solving crimes, helping people. Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at my mother, this woman who'd given birth to me but had never really tried to know me, and felt a strange mixture of sadness and liberation. I tried, Mom, but every time I came home all I heard was how I'd abandoned the family, how I thought I was too good for Millfield, how Dad was disappointed in me. It's hard to share your successes with people who've already decided you're a failure. Marcus had been standing silently nearby, but now he stepped forward. His earlier confidence was completely gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "Zoe," he said, his voice rough, "I owe you an apology. I had no idea about your work, about what you've accomplished. You thought exactly what you wanted to think," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "You decided that because I left Millfield, I must have failed. Because I didn't take over Dad's business, I must be selfish. You never bothered to find out what I was actually doing with my life." Marcus nodded slowly, looking more deflated than I'd ever seen him. "You're right, I was wrong. I'm sorry." Agent Kane had been standing quietly nearby, giving our family space to process what had just happened. Now she approached me with a slight smile. "Agent Harper," she said, "I hope you don't mind that I shared some details about your work. I know we usually keep a low profile, but I couldn't stand by and listen to someone misrepresent the contributions of one of our finest agents." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. "That was unexpected, but I appreciate it." "There's actually something else I wanted to discuss with you," Agent Kane said. "The promotion I mentioned, it's not just a possibility. The paperwork has already been submitted." "Congratulations, Supervisory Special Agent Harper. The promotion becomes official Monday morning." I stared at her, barely able to process what I was hearing. A promotion to Supervisory Special Agent meant not just a significant increase in responsibility and salary, but recognition as one of the Bureau's rising stars. It meant leading my own team, handling the most complex cases, and having real influence in shaping how the FBI approached financial crimes. "I thank you," I stammered. "I had no idea." "You've earned it," Agent Kane said firmly. "Your work speaks for itself. The Bureau needs agents like you in leadership positions." As Agent Kane walked back toward her car, I stood in the cemetery surrounded by my family, feeling like I was seeing them clearly for the first time in years. Mom looked older and more fragile than I'd realized, but also genuinely remorseful. Marcus looked like someone who'd just had his entire worldview challenged and found it wanting. The rain had stopped completely now, and weak sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds. In the distance I could see the last of the funeral attendees getting into their cars, probably heading to the church hall for the reception, where they would undoubtedly spend the next few hours discussing what they'd just witnessed. "Will you come to the reception?" Mom asked hesitantly. "People would probably like to talk to you to hear about your work." I considered it for a moment. Part of me wanted to go, to bask in the vindication of finally being seen and respected by the community that had watched me grow up. But another part of me realized that I didn't need their validation anymore. I'd found my purpose, my calling, my real family in the work I did, and the colleagues who respected and valued my contributions. "I think I'll head back to Philadelphia," I said gently. "I have cases to review, and I want to prepare for my new position." Mom nodded, though she looked disappointed. Will you call more often? I'd like to hear about your work if you're willing to share." "I'd like that," I said, and surprised myself by meaning, "but I need you to understand something, Mom. I didn't leave Millfield because I thought I was better than it. I left because I had something important to do with my life, and I couldn't do it here. That doesn't make me selfish. It makes me someone who found her purpose and followed." Marcus stepped forward again, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. "Zoe, what I said in the church, about Dad being disappointed, I was wrong. I think he would have been proud of you. I think he would have been amazed by what you've accomplished." I looked at my brother, this man who'd tormented me throughout childhood and had just tried to humiliate me at our father's funeral, and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a kind of letting go. His opinion of me no longer had the power to hurt me because I finally understood that it was based on his own insecurities and limitations, not on any real assessment of who I was, or what I'd achieved. "Maybe," I said, "but it doesn't matter anymore. Marcus, I know who I am and what I'm worth. I don't need Dad's approval or yours to validate my choices. As I walked back toward my rental car, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of my family's disappointment, which I'd carried for so long, was finally lifted. I'd spent 5 years trying to prove myself worthy of their love and respect, never realizing that the problem wasn't my worthiness. It was their inability to see beyond their own narrow definition of success. Behind me, I could hear Mom and Marcus talking quietly, probably trying to process everything that had just happened. Part of me felt sorry for them, for the years they'd spent dismissing and diminishing someone whose work they'd never bothered to understand, but mostly I felt free. Tomorrow I would return to Philadelphia as Supervisory Special Agent Zoe Harper, ready to lead my own team and take on even more complex cases. I would continue the work that gave my life meaning, protecting vulnerable people and bringing criminals to justice, and I would do it all with the knowledge that I'd chosen correctly, that the path I'd taken had led me exactly where I was supposed to be. The drive back to the airport took me through downtown Millfield, past the closed steel plant and the struggling shops on Main Street, past Harper's Auto Repair, with its faded sign and oil-stained parking lot. This was the life Marcus had wanted me to choose, the safe, small world where success was measured by how well you fit in, rather than how much you achieved. But as I drove toward the highway that would take me back to my real life, I realized that leaving Millfield hadn't been about running away from something, it had been about running toward who I was meant to become. And standing in that cemetery, listening to Agent Kane describe my work and my worth to the people who'd never seen either, I finally understood that the best revenge against those who underestimate you isn't proving them wrong. It's simply becoming exactly who you were always capable of being, with or without their approval. The phone calls started before I even reached the Philadelphia city limit. My work cell buzzed insistently against the passenger seat as I navigated the evening traffic on Interstate 76, the skyline emerging through the windshield like a promise of normalcy. I let it ring. Whatever crisis needed my attention could wait another hour. For the first time in years, I needed space to process what had just happened in that cemetery. My apartment in Center City felt like a sanctuary when I finally walked through the door. The clean lines of modern furniture, the absence of family photos or sentimental clutter, the view of the city lights stretching toward the Delaware River, everything about this space reflected the life I'd built for myself, independent of anyone else's expectations or limitations. I poured myself a glass of wine and settled into the leather chair by the window, finally allowing myself to feel the full weight of the day. The contrast was staggering. 6 hours ago I'd been sitting in a church pew while my brother publicly branded me a disappointment. Now I was a newly promoted supervisory special agent with a corner office waiting for me Monday morning. The whiplash of emotions left me feeling unmoored, as if I'd lived through multiple lifetimes in a single afternoon. My personal phone buzzed with a text from Katie Walsh, my college roommate who'd stayed in Philadelphia after graduation. Heard through the grapevine something big happened today. Coffee tomorrow. I'm buying. News traveled fast in law enforcement circles, apparently faster than I'd anticipated. The FBI promotion wasn't exactly classified information, but I hadn't expected it to spread quite so quickly. I was about to respond when my work phone rang again. This time I recognized the number, Director Sarah Chen, my current supervisor and one of the most respected agents in the Financial Crimes Division. Sarah never called on weekends unless something major was happening. Zoe, Sarah's voice was warm but professional when I answered. I heard today was eventful on multiple fronts. How are you holding up? Still processing, I admitted. The promotion news was unexpected timing. Agent Kane felt it was important you hear it from the Bureau rather than through family speculation. Sarah said. She was concerned about how you were being portrayed by people who clearly don't understand the scope of your work. I walked to the window, looking down at the Saturday evening foot traffic on Walnut Street. Young couples heading to dinner, groups of friends bar hopping, families with strollers navigating the sidewalks, all of them living their lives without any idea that people like me spent our days tracking down the criminals who would steal their retirement funds or exploit their Sarah, can I ask you something? I said. When you recommended me for promotion, What did you see in my work that made you think I was ready for supervisory responsibility? There was a pause, and I could almost hear Sarah organizing her thoughts the way she did in briefings when she wanted to make sure her message was clear and complete. Zoe, in 15 years with the Bureau, I've worked with a lot of talented agents, but you have something that can't be taught. You see patterns that others miss, and you never give up on victims. The Morrison case. Most agents would have closed that after the first few months when the paper trail went cold. You kept digging because you knew there were more victims out there. And you were right. The Morrison case had been a nightmare of shell companies and cryptocurrency transfers that seemed designed specifically to frustrate investigators. But something about the timing of the transactions had bothered me, a rhythm that suggested the fraud was still active. I'd spent weekends tracing financial records, following leads that seemed to dead end, until finally finding the connection that broke the whole scheme open. The Chen trafficking investigation was even more impressive. Sarah continued. You took financial data that looked like random business transactions and built a map of how money moved through their entire operation. That analysis didn't just help us convict the leadership, it helped us identify and rescue victims. I remembered that case vividly. The financial records had been deliberately obscured, designed to look like legitimate import-export business, but I'd noticed discrepancies in the timing and amounts that suggested something else entirely. Mapping out those transactions had revealed a pattern of payments that corresponded to human trafficking routes across 3 states. But it's not just your technical skills, Sarah said. It's your judgment, your integrity, your ability to see the human cost behind the number. When you brief a case, you don't just present data, you tell the story of how crimes affected real people. That's what makes you ready to lead a team. After we hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, city lights beginning to twinkle beyond the window. For 5 years, I'd been measuring my worth against my family's expectations, wondering if maybe they were right about my choices. But listening to Sarah describe my work from her perspective, I realized I'd been asking the wrong question. The question wasn't whether my family understood or approved of my career. The question was whether I was using my skills and talents in ways that mattered, whether I was making a difference in the world. And the answer to that question was unequivocally yes. Sunday morning brought another surprise. I was reviewing case files at my kitchen table, preparing for the leadership transition, when my doorman called to announce an unexpected visitor. Ms. Harper, there's a gentleman here to see you. Says his name is Marcus Harper, claims to be your brother. My stomach tightened. Marcus had never been to Philadelphia, had never shown any interest in seeing where I lived or how I'd built my life. His presence here, less than 24 hours after the cemetery confrontation, couldn't be coincidental. Send him up, I said, already regretting the decision. Marcus looked uncomfortable when I opened the door, like someone who'd ventured far outside his comfort zone and wasn't sure how to navigate unfamiliar territory. He was still wearing the black suit from yesterday's funeral, though he'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves. His eyes moved around my apartment's entryway, taking in the hardwood floors and modern fixtures, with something that might have been surprise. Nice place, he said awkwardly. I drove down this morning, thought we should talk. I gestured him toward the living room, noting how out of place he looked among the contemporary furniture and abstract art. Marcus had always been most comfortable in familiar surroundings, the auto shop, local bars, places where everyone knew his name and his story. Here, he was just another visitor in a city full of strangers. How did you find my address? I asked, settling into the chair across from the couch where he'd seated himself. Mom had it from some Christmas card you sent a couple years ago, he said. Zoe, I came here to apologize. Really apologize, not just the quick sorry I managed yesterday. I waited, curious to see what version of remorse Marcus would offer in private, away from the audience of family and community members who'd witnessed his public humiliation. I've been thinking all night about what that FBI agent said, Marcus continued, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. About your work, about what you've accomplished. I realized I never actually asked you about your job. Not really. I just assumed. You assumed I was a failure because I didn't stay in Millfield. I said evenly. You assumed that leaving meant I thought I was better than everyone else. Marcus winced. Yeah, I did assume that. And I was wrong. He looked around the apartment again, his gaze lingering on the diplomas and commendations hung on the far wall. This is all really yours. The apartment, the career. Everything. Everything. I've worked for. I confirmed. No family money. No connections. No shortcuts. Just the education you mocked and the career choices you dismissed. He was quiet for a long moment, processing information that clearly contradicted everything he'd believed about my life for the past 5 years. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, less certain than the confident tone he'd used at the funeral. Zoe, I need you to understand something. When you left for college, it felt like abandon. Dad poured everything into that auto shop, worked 16-hour days to build something he could pass down. When you chose a different path, it felt like rejection of everything he'd sacrificed for. I studied my brother's face, seeing something I'd rarely witnessed there: genuine vulnerability. Marcus had always projected confidence, had always seemed certain of his place in the world and his right to judge others. This uncertainty was new. Marcus, I said carefully, Dad's dream was his dream, not mine. I never asked him to build something for me to inherit. I never promised to take over the shop. You decided that was my obligation without ever asking what I wanted. But family businesses are supposed to stay in the family, he protested, though with less conviction than usual. That's how it works. You build something and pass it down to children who want it, I said, to children who have the skills and passion for it. Did it ever occur to you that maybe I wasn't suited for that life, that maybe I had different strength, different interests? Marcus was quiet again, and I could see him struggling with concepts that challenged his fundamental understanding of family loyalty and obligation. He'd been raised with the belief that children owed their parents certain forms of gratitude and service, regardless of their own aspirations or abilities. What you do, he said finally, the FBI stuff, is it really as important as that agent made it sound? I walked to my desk and returned with a thick folder case summaries and victim impact statements from investigations I'd led over the past 3 years. I handed it to Marcus and watched as he opened it, his expression changing as he read. The first document was a letter from an elderly couple in Delaware, whose retirement savings I'd helped recover after they'd fallen victim to an investment scam. They'd lost everything to criminals who'd promised guaranteed returns on government bonds that didn't exist. My investigation had traced their money through multiple shell companies and offshore accounts, eventually recovering 80% of their stolen funds. This couple, I said, pointing to their letter, would have lost their home without the work my team did. They're in their 70s and those criminals stole 40 years of savings in 6 months. Marcus read silently, his expression growing more serious with each page. There were letters from families whose children's college funds had been stolen, from small business owners who'd been defrauded by fake loan companies, from immigrant families who'd lost money to scammers who promised help with legal status. All of these people, I continued, were targeted because they were vulnerable: the elderly, the desperate, people who trusted the wrong person at the wrong time. The criminals who victimized them are sophisticated, organized and ruthless. They don't care whose life they destroy as long as they profit. One letter was from the daughter of a woman who'd been targeted by a romance scammer, a criminal who'd spent months building an online relationship with her widowed mother before convincing her to send thousands of dollars for a fake emergency. The daughter wrote about her mother's shame and depression after realizing she'd been manipulated, about how the emotional trauma had been almost worse than the financial loss. My investigation into that romance scam, I said, led to a network of criminals operating across 5 states. We identified over 200 victims and recovered more than $3 million, but more importantly, we stopped them from victimizing anyone else. Marcus closed the folder and handed it back to me, his face pale. I had no idea, he said quietly. I don't know what I thought. That you pushed papers around all day, maybe arrested people for parking tickets. The Morrison case that Agent Kane mentioned, I said. That was $12 million stolen from a pension. Teachers, firefighters, police officers, people who'd worked their entire careers and trusted their union to protect their retirement savings. The criminals had set up fake investment companies and were slowly draining the fund while reporting fake returns to hide the theft. I could see Marcus trying to wrap his mind around the scope and complexity of what I dealt with every day. His world of auto repair was straightforward. Cars broke down. You fixed them. Customers paid you. The financial crimes I investigated involved layers of deception, international money transfers, and facilitated schemes designed specifically to evade law enforcement. How did you learn to do this stuff? He asked. I mean, how do you even begin to understand how these criminals think? Training, experience, and a lot of studying, I said. The FBI Academy was just the beginning. I've spent years learning about financial systems, cryptocurrency, international banking, psychology of fraud victims and perpetrators. It's not something you can just figure out as you go along. Marcus shook his head slowly. And I accused you of abandoning the family for an easy government job. You accused me of thinking I was better than Millfield, I corrected. You never asked what I actually did for work. You never showed any interest in my life beyond whether I was coming home for holidays. Because I was jealous, he said suddenly, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they surprised me. You got out. You built something bigger than what Dad had. Something more important. And instead of being proud of you, I resented you for succeeding where I was afraid to try. The admission hung in the air between us, raw and honest in a way that Marcus rarely allowed himself to be. I realized this might be the first time in our adult relationship that he'd acknowledged any vulnerability or uncertainty about his own choices. Marcus, I said gently, there's nothing wrong with staying in Millfield, with taking over Dad's business. That's meaningful work too. But it wasn't my path. And that doesn't make me selfish or disloyal. I know that now, he said. Or I'm starting to understand it anyway. But Zoe, what I said at the funeral, in front of all those people, I don't know how to take that back. You can't take it back, I said simply. But you can do better going forward. You can learn about what I actually do instead of making assumptions. You can support me instead of undermining me. Marcus nodded, though he still looked troubled. Will you give me another chance? I know I don't deserve it after yesterday, but I want to try to be a better brother. I looked at this man who'd tormented me throughout childhood, who'd spent years dismissing my achievements and questioning my choices, who'd used our father's funeral as an opportunity to humiliate me publicly. But I also saw someone who was genuinely trying to confront his own prejudices and limitations, someone who was asking for forgiveness rather than demanding it. We can try, I said finally, but things have to be different. Marcus, I'm not going to keep defending my life choices to you. I'm not going to apologize for succeeding or for building a career that matters to me. I understand, he said. And Zoe, for what it's worth, I'm proud of you. I should have said that years ago, but I'm saying it now. After Marcus left for the drive back to Pennsylvania, I stood at my window watching the Sunday evening traffic flow along the streets below. The conversation had been more honest and productive than any we'd had in years, but I found myself feeling cautiously optimistic rather than celebratory. Words were easy. Changing ingrained patterns of behavior was much harder. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Marcus told me about his visit. I want you to know how proud I am of you, honey. I'm sorry it took so long for us to see what was right in front of. Another text followed from Tyler Rodriguez, my cousin who'd always been the family mediator. Heard about yesterday's drama, also heard about the promotion. Want to grab dinner next time you're in the area? I'd love to hear about your work. For the first time in years, my family seemed genuinely interested in understanding my life rather than judging it. The change felt fragile, uncertain, but real enough to offer hope for something better. Monday morning arrived with the crisp efficiency that I'd always loved about federal buildings. The FBI field office hummed with purposeful activity, agents reviewing case files, preparing for court testimony, coordinating with other agencies on joint investigation. This was my world, the place where my skills and dedication translated into tangible results. Agent Kane was waiting in what would soon be my new office, a corner space with windows overlooking Independence Hall. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. From this office I would lead investigations that protected the principles upon which the country was founded. "Ready for your first briefing as a supervisory special agent?" she asked, gesturing to a stack of files on the desk. "More than ready," I said, settling into the chair that still felt surreal to occupy. The cases were complex and challenging. A cryptocurrency fraud targeting military veterans, a Ponzi scheme operating through religious communities, an identity theft ring that had stolen millions from small business. Each file represented dozens or hundreds of victims, whose lives had been disrupted by criminals who saw vulnerability as opportunity. "Your team is excited to work under your leadership," Agent Kane said. "They've seen your work on the Morrison and Chen cases. They know they're getting someone who understands both the technical and human aspects of financial crime." As she left me to review the files, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 5 years ago I'd been a new agent, fresh from Quantico, eager to prove myself but uncertain about where my career would lead. Today I was a supervisory special agent, with a team of experienced investigators, looking to me for leadership. The phone rang, interrupting my review of case file. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. "Agent Harper," I answered. "Zoe, it's Mrs. Patterson, from next door to your mom." The voice was elderly but clear, tinged with something that sounded like excitement. "I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from your mother." "Of course, Mrs. Patterson. Is everything all right?" "Oh yes, dear. I'm calling because my granddaughter Sarah is studying criminal justice at Temple University. After what happened at your father's funeral, she's been asking about careers in federal law enforcement. I was wondering if you might be willing to talk to her sometime about what you do." I smiled, remembering Sarah Patterson as a quiet teenager who'd always been fascinated by crime shows on television. The idea that my career might inspire someone else to pursue similar work felt like an unexpected gift. "I'd be happy to talk with her," I said. "Have her email me, and we can set up a time for coffee or a phone call." "Thank you so much, Zoe, and I want you to know, we're all so proud of you, what you've accomplished, what you do for people. It's extraordinary." After Miss Patterson hung up, I sat quietly in my new office, looking out at the city where I'd built my career and my life. The contrast with Saturday's funeral was striking. Instead of being dismissed and diminished, I was being celebrated and sought out for guidance. Instead of defending my choices, I was inspiring others to follow similar paths. The afternoon brought a steady stream of meetings, briefings with current team members, introductions to supervisors from other divisions, discussions about ongoing investigations that would now fall under my oversight. Each interaction reinforced the same message: I had earned my place here through competence, dedication, and result. As the day wound down, I found myself thinking about the letter I wanted to write to Dad, the conversation we'd never had about the work I'd chosen, and the difference it made in the world. He'd died thinking I was a disappointment, never knowing that his daughter had become someone who protected families like ours from sophisticated criminals. But perhaps that was okay. Perhaps the validation I'd spent years seeking from him was less important than the validation I'd earned from victims whose lives I'd helped restore, from colleagues who respected my skills, from a bureau that had entrusted me with increasing responsibility and authority. My phone buzzed with a text from Katie Walsh. "Dinner tomorrow. I want to hear everything about this promotion and whatever happened at the funeral. Also bringing champagne, because this calls for celebration." Another text followed from an unknown number. "Agent Harper, this is Sarah Patterson. My grandmother said, you might be willing to talk about FBI careers. I'm really interested in financial crimes investigation." As I packed up my case files and prepared to leave the office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete alignment between who I was and where I belonged. The work challenged me, the results mattered, and the recognition was based on merit rather than family connections or social expectations. Walking through Center City toward my apartment, I passed the same restaurants and shops I'd walked by for 3 years, but tonight, everything felt different. Tonight, I wasn't just another federal employee making her way home from work. I was Supervisory Special Agent Zoe Harper, leader of a team dedicated to protecting vulnerable people from sophisticated criminals. The cemetery confrontation that had felt so devastating just 2 days ago now seemed like a necessary turning point. the moment when I finally stopped trying to prove my worth to people who'd never bothered to understand. Instead, I'd found my worth reflected in the respect of colleagues, the gratitude of victims, and the trust of an organization that had bet on my ability to lead. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference in the world. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace with the path I'd chosen and the person I'd become. 3 weeks into my new role as supervisory special agent, the Morrison cryptocurrency case took an unexpected turn that would test every leadership skill I'd developed. Agent Jennifer Liu knocked on my office door at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, her usually composed expression tight with concern. "We've got a problem with the Hartwell investigation," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "The suspect's attorney is claiming prosecutorial misconduct, and they're demanding all our financial analysis be thrown out." The Hartwell case involved a sophisticated cryptocurrency laundering operation that had processed over $40 million in stolen funds through a network of digital wallets and fake exchanges. We'd spent 6 months building the case, tracing transactions through blockchain records and identifying the money's ultimate destinations. It was exactly the kind of complex investigation that had led to my promotion, and now it was threatened by legal challenges that could unravel months of work. "What's their specific claim?" I asked, pulling up the case files on my computer. "They're saying we exceeded our warrant authority when we analyzed the blockchain transactions," Jennifer explained. "Their position is that following cryptocurrency through multiple wallets constitutes an unreasonable search that violates the Fourth Amendment." I'd seen this argument before. Defense attorneys were increasingly challenging digital financial investigations by claiming that traditional search warrant concepts didn't apply to cryptocurrency transactions. It was a legal gray area that required careful navigation and thorough documentation of every investigative step. "Schedule a meeting with the prosecutor's office for this afternoon," I said. "We need to review our warrant applications and make sure our methodology is bulletproof. Also, pull together all our supporting documentation. I want to be able to demonstrate that every transaction we traced was within the scope of our authorized investigation." As Jennifer left to coordinate the meeting, I found myself thinking about the evolution of financial crimes in the digital age. When I'd started with the FBI, most investigations involved traditional paper trails, bank records, wire transfers, physical documents that created clear evidence chain. Cryptocurrency had changed everything, requiring investigators to develop new skills and prosecutors to adapt centuries-old legal concepts to technologies that didn't exist when the Constitution was written. My phone rang, interrupting my case review. The caller ID showed Tyler Rodriguez, my cousin who'd been surprisingly supportive since Dad's funeral. "Zoe, I hope you don't mind me calling during work hours," Tyler said. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something that's happening in Millfield." "What kind of something?" I asked, immediately concerned that family drama was about to complicate my professional life again. "Marcus has been talking to people," Tyler said. "Not bad stuff this time. Actually, he's been telling everyone about your promotion, about the cases you've solved. Well, he's basically become your biggest advocate in town." I sat back in my chair, surprised by this development. 3 weeks ago, Marcus had been publicly humiliating me at Dad's funeral. Now he was apparently promoting my achievements to anyone who would listen. "He organized a little celebration at Murphy's bar last weekend," Tyler continued. "Nothing big, just some family and neighbors. He kept showing people articles about FBI investigations, talking about how proud he is of his sister, the federal agent. It was actually pretty sweet. Part of me felt touched by Marcus's efforts to repair the damage he'd done to my reputation in Millfield, but another part wondered if this newfound support was genuine or just his way of managing his own guilt about the funeral incident." "How's Mom handling all this?" I asked. "She's been asking me about your work," Tyler said. "She wants to understand what you do, but she's embarrassed about how little she knew before. I think she's afraid to call you directly." After Tyler and I hung up, I stared out my office window at the bustling streets of Philadelphia. The relationship with my family felt fragile, like something that could shatter if any of us pushed too hard or expected too much too quickly. But there was also something hopeful about their apparent desire to understand and support my career, even if it had taken a public confrontation to prompt that change. The meeting with the prosecutor's office went better than expected. Assistant District Attorney Michael Stone reviewed our warrant applications and investigative methodology with the thoroughness of someone who understood that one legal misstep could compromise months of work. "Your documentation is solid," he concluded after 2 hours of review. "Every blockchain analysis is clearly within the scope of your original warrant. The defense is fishing, hoping to find a procedural error that doesn't exist." "What's our next step?" I asked. "We file a comprehensive response detailing your investigative process," Stone said. "I want a timeline showing how each piece of evidence was obtained, citations for every legal precedent, supporting cryptocurrency investigation, and expert testimony about blockchain analysis methodology." As my team worked on assembling the legal response, I found myself reflecting on how much my role had changed since the promotion. As a line agent, I'd focused primarily on the investigative aspects of cases, following financial trails, interviewing witnesses, analyzing evidence. As a supervisor, I was responsible for ensuring that our investigations could withstand legal challenges, that our team's work would hold up in court and lead to successful prosecutions. The responsibility was heavier than I'd anticipated, but also more satisfying. Every case we built correctly meant victims would receive justice and criminals would face consequences for their actions. Every legal challenge we successfully defended meant our investigative methods would continue protecting vulnerable people from sophisticated financial crime. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor to the field office. I was reviewing team assignments when my assistant announced that Agent Kane was here to see me, accompanied by someone from FBI headquarters in Washington. Assistant Director Patricia Gomez was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s with the kind of precise bearing that suggested military background. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and got straight to business. "Agent Harper, I've been reviewing your work on the Morrison case and the recent Chen trafficking investigation," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "I'm here because we're forming a new task force focused on cryptocurrency-related financial crimes, and we want you to lead it." I felt my pulse quicken. A task force leadership position would mean coordinating investigations across multiple field offices, working with international partners, and setting bureau policy for an entire category of financial crime. The position would be based here in Philadelphia, Director Gomez continued, "but you'd have authority over cryptocurrency investigations nationwide. Your team would include agents from 6 different field offices, analysts from the Financial Intelligence Unit, and liaisons with international law enforcement agencies." "What's the time commitment?" I asked, already thinking about how this opportunity could impact my current cases and team responsibilities. 2 years initially, with possibility for extension," Agent Kane said. "It's a significant career opportunity, but we understand it's also a major commitment. You'd be essentially writing the playbook for how the FBI investigates cryptocurrency crimes." After they left, I sat alone in my office trying to process what had just been offered. 6 months ago, I'd been a line agent working individual cases. 3 weeks ago, I'd been promoted to supervise a single team. Now I was being asked to lead a national task force that would shape how federal law enforcement approached an entire category of emerging crimes. The opportunity was extraordinary, but it also felt overwhelming. Leading a task force meant leaving behind the hands-on investigative work that had drawn me to the FBI in the first place. It meant more meetings, more administrative responsibilities, and less direct contact with victims and witnesses. But it also meant having the power to protect more people, to build systems that would prevent financial crimes rather than just responding to them after they occurred. My phone buzzed with a text from Katie Walsh. "Drinks tonight. You look like you need to process something big." Katie had an uncanny ability to sense when I was wrestling with important decisions, probably developed through years of friendship and countless conversations about career challenge. We met at our usual spot, a quiet wine bar in Rittenhouse Square that attracted more business professionals than college students. Katie listened without interruption as I explained the task force opportunity, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me work through my thoughts out loud. It sounds like exactly the kind of opportunity you've been working toward, she said when I finished. But you're worried about something. I'm worried about losing touch with why I became an agent in the first place, I admitted. The individual cases, the victims whose lives you can actually impact direct. Leading a task force means focusing on policy and procedure instead of investigation and prosecution. Katie swirled her wine thoughtfully. Do you remember when you first told me about the Morrison case? You weren't just excited about solving it. You were excited about what it meant for other potential victims. You kept talking about how the investigative techniques you'd developed could be used to stop similar schemes before they got started. She was right. I'd spent hours explaining to Katie how the patterns I'd identified in the Morrison investigation could be applied to other cases, how the analytical methods I'd developed could help other agents recognize similar schemes earlier in their development. This task force position, Katie continued, sounds like it would let you do that on a national scale. Instead of protecting hundreds of victims, you'd be building systems to protect thousands. Friday morning brought news that the Hartwell defense motion had been denied. Our legal response had successfully demonstrated that every aspect of our cryptocurrency investigation was properly authorized and methodologically sound. More importantly, the judge's ruling established precedent that would make similar defense challenges less likely to succeed in the future. This is huge, Jennifer Liu said, reviewing the court's decision. This ruling basically validates blockchain analysis as a legitimate investigative technique. Every cryptocurrency investigation in the district just got easy. I found myself thinking about the broader implications of our legal victory. The Hartwell case wasn't just about one criminal operation. It was about establishing the legal framework that would allow law enforcement to effectively investigate cryptocurrency crimes for years to come. This was exactly the kind of systematic impact that the task force position would allow me to achieve on a national level. That afternoon, I called Director Gomez to accept the task force leadership position. The conversation was brief and professional, focused on logistics and timeline rather than congratulations or ceremony. But after I hung up, I felt a sense of anticipation that I hadn't experienced since my first day as an FBI agent. The weekend brought an unexpected call from Mom. Her voice was tentative, uncertain, as if she wasn't sure she had the right to intrude on my professional success. Zoe, honey, I wanted to call and tell you how proud I am, she said. Marcus explained to me about your promotion, about the important work you're doing. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. Mom, you don't have to apologize, I said, though part of me appreciated hearing the words. I know my work is complicated to explain. I've been reading articles online, she said, her voice gaining confidence, about financial crimes, about the FBI. I want to understand what you do, even if I don't grasp all the technical details. We talked for nearly an hour, the longest conversation we'd had in years. Mom asked thoughtful questions about my cases, expressed genuine amazement at the scope of the crimes I investigated, and shared stories about how people in Millfield had been responding to news of my achievements. Miss Patterson's granddaughter Sarah has been telling everyone that she wants to be an FBI agent like you, Mom said. She's applying to internship programs and asking everyone about criminal justice programs. You've become something of a role model around here. After we hung up, I realized that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with my family. For the first time in years, they were seeing me as I actually was rather than as a projection of their own expectations and limitations. The conversation with Mom hadn't been about when I was coming home or whether I was happy with my choices. It had been about understanding and celebrating what I'd accomplished. Monday morning brought my first briefing as task force leader. The conference room was filled with agents from across the country, analysts from various FBI divisions, and representatives from international law enforcement agencies. The diversity of experience and expertise was remarkable. Agents who specialized in organized crime, cybercrime investigators, financial analysts who understood global banking systems, and technical specialists who could trace cryptocurrency transactions across international boundaries. Cryptocurrency-related financial crimes have increased by 400% over the past 2 years, I began, addressing the assembled team. Traditional investigative methods are often inadequate for tracking digital assets that can be transferred internationally in minutes and hidden through complex mixing services. I outlined our task force objectives, developing standardized investigative protocols, creating training programs for field agents, establishing partnerships with international law enforcement agencies, and building analytical tools that could keep pace with rapidly evolving criminal techniques. Our success will be measured not just by the cases we solve, I continued, but by the systems we build to prevent crimes before they occur. We're not just investigating individual criminals, we're creating the framework that will protect financial systems for years to come. Agent David Park from the San Francisco field office raised his hand. What's our authority for international cooperation? A lot of these cases involve cryptocurrency exchanges and wallet services based in countries that may not have formal agreements with the United States. It was exactly the kind of complex question that demonstrated why this task force was necessary. Traditional financial crimes typically involved institutions that were subject to U.S. regulation and oversight. Cryptocurrency crimes often involved services based in countries with different legal frameworks and varying levels of cooperation with American law enforcement. We're working with the State Department and international law enforcement organizations to develop new cooperation protocols, I explained. Part of our mandate is to identify legal and procedural obstacles that prevent effective international investigation of cryptocurrency crime. The briefing lasted 3 hours, covering everything from technical analysis methods to legal precedents to international cooperation framework. Agent Lisa Chen from the Miami field office approached me after the briefing. I wanted to thank you for taking on this leadership role, she said. I've been working cryptocurrency cases for 2 years, mostly trial and error because there weren't established protocols. Having systematic approaches and standardized training will make a huge difference. Similar conversations continued throughout the week as team members shared their experiences and challenges with cryptocurrency investigation. The common theme was frustration with the gap between the sophistication of criminal operations and the tools available to investigate them. Traditional financial investigation techniques, developed for paper-based transactions and regulated institutions, were often inadequate for tracking digital assets that could be transferred and concealed using methods that didn't exist 5 years ago. By Friday, we had developed a preliminary framework for the task force's operations. Teams would be organized by geographic region, but would collaborate on cases that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Analytical resources would be centralized to avoid duplication of effort and ensure consistent methodology. Training programs would be developed for field agents who needed to develop cryptocurrency investigation skills. This is the kind of work that changes how the entire bureau approaches an entire category of crime, Agent Kane said during our weekly check-in. You're not just solving individual cases, you're building institutional knowledge that will benefit investigations for decades. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the week's accomplishments and challenges. The task force position was everything I'd hoped for professionally: complex, impactful, and directly aligned with my skills and interests. But it was also demanding in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Leading a national team meant balancing competing priorities, managing personalities and egos, and making decisions that would affect investigations across the country. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter who was studying criminal justice. Agent Harper, I know you're busy, but I was wondering if you might have time for a quick phone call. I'm applying for FBI internships, and would love any advice you might be willing to share. I called her immediately, remembering my own uncertainty as a college student trying to understand federal law enforcement careers. Sarah was articulate and well-prepared, asking thoughtful questions about the application process, training requirements, and career progression within the bureau. What drew you to financial crimes investigation? She asked. The complexity and the impact, I said. Financial crimes often target the most vulnerable people, the elderly, immigrants, people who don't understand complex financial systems. But they're also some of the most sophisticated criminal operations, requiring investigators to understand technology, psychology, law, and international finance. Every case is a puzzle that affects real people's lives. That's exactly what I want to do, Sarah said, her enthusiasm evident even over the phone. I want to protect people who can't protect themselves. After we hung up, I realized that my career had come full circle in an unexpected way. 5 years ago, I'd left Millfield feeling like my family and community didn't understand or value my aspirations. Now I was returning as a role model for the next generation, demonstrating that it was possible to build a meaningful career in federal law enforcement. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who'd dismissed my career choices were now celebrating my achievements and encouraging their own children to follow similar paths. But rather than feeling vindicated or resentful, I felt grateful for the opportunity to inspire others who might be struggling with similar decisions about their futures. Saturday brought an unexpected development. Marcus called to tell me that Harper's Auto Repair had been approached by the FBI's Philadelphia field office about servicing their fleet vehicles. Apparently, someone at the bureau had recommended the shop after learning about my family connection to the business. They said they'd heard good things about our work, Marcus explained, his voice filled with pride. The fleet manager mentioned that Agent Harper had spoken highly of our quality and reliability. I hadn't spoken to anyone about Marcus's business, but I suspected Agent Kane or one of my colleagues had researched my background and decided to support my family's business as a gesture of goodwill. The federal contract would provide steady income and prestigious clientele for the auto shop, exactly the kind of opportunity that Marcus had always hoped for but had never expected to receive through his sister's federal law enforcement connection. Marcus, that's wonderful, I said, genuinely pleased that something good was coming to my family as a result of my career rather than in spite of it. You've built a solid reputation over the years. They wouldn't have chosen your shop unless they were confident in your work. Zoe, Marcus said, his voice growing serious, I want you to know that I understand now what you've accomplished, the respect you've earned. I get it, and I'm proud of you. Really proud. The conversation was brief, but it felt significant. For the first time in our adult relationship, Marcus and I were connecting as equals, each of us successful in our own chosen fields, each of us contributing to our community in meaningful ways. Sunday evening, I stood at my apartment window looking out at the city lights, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I'd been a line agent working individual cases. Today, I was leading a national task force that would shape how federal law enforcement approached cryptocurrency crimes for years to come. The path hadn't been what I'd expected when I first left Millfield for college. I'd thought success meant proving my worth to the people who'd raised me, earning their approval and understanding. Instead, I'd learned that real success meant finding work that aligned with my values and abilities, building relationships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation, and using my skills to make a meaningful difference in the world. The family relationships were healing, slowly and carefully, but they were no longer the measure of my worth. Whether Mom understood my work or Marcus supported my choices mattered less than it once had, not because I cared less about them, but because I'd found other sources of validation and meaning. As I prepared for another week of leading the task force, I felt a sense of purpose and satisfaction that had nothing to do with external approval. The work was challenging and important, the team was talented and dedicated, and the potential impact was enormous. Most importantly, the work was mine, chosen freely, pursued passionately, and executed with skills I'd developed through years of study and practice. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to protect vulnerable people from sophisticated criminals. But tonight, for the first time since Dad's funeral, I felt completely at peace with the choices I'd made, and the person I'd become. The girl who'd left Millfield in search of something bigger had found exactly what she'd been looking for, even if it had taken years to recognize it. The breakthrough in the Meridian case came at 2:30 on a Wednesday morning, when Agent Park's team in San Francisco traced a series of cryptocurrency transactions that led directly to a money laundering operation spanning 3 continents. I was in my office reviewing intelligence reports when the secure phone rang, David's voice crackling through the encrypted connection with barely contained excitement. "Zoe, we've got them," he said. "The wallet addresses we've been monitoring just connected to an exchange in Singapore that's been processing payments for a human trafficking network. This isn't just financial crime anymore. We're looking at forced labor operations across 12 states." I was already pulling up the shared database, watching as transaction records populated on my screen in real time. The Meridian investigation had started 6 months ago as a straightforward cryptocurrency fraud case, criminals using fake investment platforms to steal retirement funds from elderly victims. But the deeper our task force dug, the more complex the operation became. The stolen funds weren't just being laundered, they were financing criminal enterprises that exploited some of the most vulnerable people in the world. How solid is the connection? I asked, cross-referencing the transaction data with known trafficking indicators from our intelligence database. Ironclad, David replied. The timing patterns match labor recruitment cycles, the amounts correspond to transportation and housing costs, and we've identified at least 47 victims who were moved using routes that exactly match the money flow. This was the kind of case that validated every decision I'd made about accepting the task force leadership position. We weren't just following digital breadcrumbs through cryptocurrency networks, we were uncovering systematic exploitation that traditional investigative methods would have missed entirely. The technical complexity that made these crimes so difficult to detect also created digital footprints that skilled analysts could decode and follow. David, I want you to coordinate with the Human Trafficking Task Force immediately, I said, already mentally organizing the resources we'd need for a multi-agency operation. And get me Agent Rodriguez from the Dallas office. Her team has been tracking similar patterns in the southwestern transportation corridors. The next 6 hours blurred together in a coordinated frenzy of intelligence sharing, warrant applications, and operational plan. By 9 a.m., we had 37 agents across 6 states preparing for simultaneous raids on locations connected to the trafficking network. The Justice Department had assigned 2 additional prosecutors to handle what was rapidly becoming one of the largest financial-enabled trafficking cases in Bureau history. Agent Sarah Martinez from the Human Trafficking Task Force joined our coordination center, bringing expertise in victim services and rescue operations that complemented our financial investigation capability. Sarah had been working trafficking cases for 8 years, and her presence reminded me that behind every cryptocurrency transaction we traced were real people whose lives had been stolen and commodified by criminals. The financial analysis your team developed is extraordinary, Sarah said, reviewing the transaction flowcharts that showed how stolen investment funds had been converted into operational capital for trafficking operations. We've never been able to map the money side of these networks with this level of detail. Usually we're working backwards from victims and hoping to find the financial connections. The cryptocurrency angle changes everything, I explained. Traditional money laundering required criminals to move funds through regulated institutions that created paper trails and required compliance reporting. Digital assets let them move money internationally in minutes, while obscuring the source and destination of funds. The tactical operations began at precisely 11 a.m. Eastern Time, with teams executing search warrants at financial service companies, fake business fronts, and residential properties that served as processing centers for both stolen funds and trafficking victims. I monitored the coordinated raids from our task force command center, watching real-time updates from teams across the country as they uncovered evidence that connected digital financial crimes to physical exploitation. Agent Jennifer Liu provided running commentary from the Philadelphia raid site. We've got servers, hard drives, and what looks like victim transportation records. The suspects were using the same systems to track cryptocurrency transactions and manage human cargo. The scope of the operation became clear as evidence accumulated throughout the day. The criminals had created an integrated enterprise that used sophisticated investment fraud to generate capital, cryptocurrency laundering to move and hide funds, and those proceeds to finance trafficking operations that generated additional revenue through forced labor and sexual exploitation. This is what we trained for, Agent Chen said during our afternoon briefing. Complex, multi-jurisdictional cases that require technical expertise and interagency coordination. 6 months ago, these connections would have been invisible to law enforcement. By evening, we had arrested 23 suspects, recovered over $4 million in cryptocurrency and traditional assets,
and most importantly identified 67 trafficking victims who were receiving medical care and victim services. The financial investigation that had started with elderly fraud victims had led to the rescue of people who had been enslaved by the same criminal network. The media attention was immediate and intense. Federal prosecutors held a press conference the next morning, describing the case as a landmark example of how emerging financial technologies were being exploited by traditional criminal enterprises. My name was mentioned several times as the task force leader who had developed the investigative methodology that made the operation possible. The coverage felt surreal. 2 years ago I'd been a line agent working individual cases with minimal public recognition. Now I was being quoted in national news stories as an expert on cryptocurrency crime and human trafficking investigation. The professional validation was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that our work had directly led to the rescue of people who had been trapped in situations of unimaginable exploitation. Director Gomez called personally to congratulate the task force team. "This operation demonstrates exactly why we created your unit," she said. "You've shown that cryptocurrency investigations can be a gateway to understanding and disrupting much larger criminal enterprise." The Meridian case became a model for how the task force would approach future investigation. Instead of treating cryptocurrency crimes as isolated financial offenses, we began analyzing them as potential components of larger criminal enterprises that might include trafficking, drug distribution, weapons sales, or other serious felony. Agent Park's San Francisco team developed software tools that could automatically flag cryptocurrency transactions with patterns consistent with trafficking operations. Agent Rodriguez in Dallas created training materials that helped field agents recognize the financial indicators of forced labor networks.
Agent Chen in Miami established partnerships with international law enforcement agencies that allowed us to trace criminal proceeds across borders. Within 3 months of the Meridian operation, our task force had identified 17 additional cases where cryptocurrency fraud was funding trafficking operations. The pattern was becoming clear. Criminals were using technical complexity and jurisdictional confusion to operate integrated enterprises that traditional law enforcement categories couldn't adequately address. The success brought unexpected opportunities. I was invited to speak at the Internationalization of Financial Crime Investigators conference in London, presenting our methodology to law enforcement professionals from 43 countries. The presentation focused on how technological evolution in financial crimes required corresponding evolution in investigative techniques and interagency cooperation. Criminals are not bound by traditional categories, I told the audience of investigators, prosecutors, and policymakers. They don't separate financial crime from trafficking or cybercrime from traditional organized crime. Our response must be equally integrated and sophisticated. The questions from the audience revealed how widespread the challenges were. Investigators from Germany, Australia, Japan, and Brazil described similar patterns of cryptocurrency-enabled crime in their jurisdictions, often involving the same criminal networks that our task force had been tracking. The digital nature of these crimes means that a single criminal organization can victimize people across multiple continents while using financial infrastructure that spans dozens of countries, explained Chief Inspector Williams from Scotland Yard. Traditional bilateral cooperation agreements are inadequate for addressing threats that operate globally in real time. Those conversations led to the development of the International Cryptocurrency Crime Task Force, a collaborative framework that allowed law enforcement agencies to share intelligence and coordinate operations across borders. I was asked to serve as the American representative on the coordinating committee, a position that would require monthly travel to partner countries and constant coordination with international colleagues. The international role represented another significant career milestone, but it also meant further distance from the hands-on investigative work that had originally drawn me to the FBI. I found myself struggling with the same questions that had emerged when I'd first been offered the task force leadership position. How to balance the impact of policy and coordination work against the satisfaction of direct investigation and victim assistance. The answer came during a case briefing in November, when Agent Martinez presented her analysis of trafficking victims who had been identified through our financial investigation. Sarah had tracked the outcomes for every victim we'd helped rescue, documenting their recovery processes and long-term well-being. 43 of the 67 trafficking victims from the Ridian case have successfully transitioned to independent living, she reported. They've received medical care, counseling services, job training, and legal assistance to rebuild their lives. More importantly, the criminal network that exploited them has been completely dismantled. She continued with statistics that demonstrated the broader impact of our work. The investigative methods developed by this task force have been adopted by 15 other FBI field offices and shared with international partners in 27 countries. Conservative estimates suggest that these techniques have led to the identification of over 300 trafficking victims and the disruption of 47 criminal organizations. Those numbers represented individual human beings whose lives had been changed by the work we were doing. The policy development and international coordination that sometimes felt abstract and bureaucratic were actually force multipliers that allowed our investigative techniques to protect vastly more people than any individual agent could assist directly. That evening, I called Mom to share news about the international assignment. Her response surprised me with its immediate enthusiasm and pride. "Zoe, that's incredible," she said. "You're going to be working with police from other countries, like on television shows." "Sort of," I laughed, "though probably with less dramatic music and better paperwork procedures. I've been telling everyone about your work," Mom continued. "Mrs. Patterson, the ladies at church, even strangers in the grocery store when they ask what my daughter does for a living. I used to feel embarrassed because I couldn't explain it, but now I'm so proud I can't stop talking about it." The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours, with Mom asking detailed questions about international cooperation protocols and expressing genuine amazement at the scope of the criminal networks I investigate. It was the kind of conversation I'd dreamed of having with my parents for years, one where they saw my work as something valuable and important, rather than as a rejection of their values and expectations. "Your father would have been so proud," Mom said as we were ending the call. "I wish he could have lived to see everything you've accomplished." The comment brought unexpected emotion. Dad had died believing that I'd wasted my potential on a government job that took me away from family obligation. He'd never known that his daughter was protecting families like ours from sophisticated criminals, or that her work was being recognized by law enforcement professionals around the world. But perhaps his opinion mattered less now than it once had. I'd found validation in the work itself, in the victims whose lives were restored, in the colleagues who trusted my judgment, and in the knowledge that I was using my skills and education to make a meaningful difference in the world. The international assignment officially began in January, with my first coordinating committee meeting scheduled in Interpol headquarters in Lyon, France. The week before departure, I received an unexpected call from Sarah Patterson, Miss Patterson's granddaughter, who had been inspired to pursue FBI career. "Agent Harper, I wanted to let you know that I've been accepted to the FBI Academy," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "I start training in March and I requested assignment to the Financial Crimes Division." "Sarah, that's wonderful," I said, remembering my own excitement when I'd received my Academy acceptance letter. "Do you have any questions about the training program?" "Actually, I was wondering if you might be willing to serve as a mentor," she said. "I know you're incredibly busy, but having someone who understands the career path would be invaluable." I agreed immediately, recognizing the opportunity to guide someone who was following a similar path. Sarah represented something important. Proof that my career choices were inspiring the next generation of law enforcement professionals, rather than isolating me from my community. The mentoring relationship also reminded me of my own journey from uncertain college student to task force leader. 7 years ago, I'd been asking similar questions about FBI careers, unsure whether federal law enforcement was the right fit for my interests and abilities. Now I was in a position to help others navigate those same decisions and challenges. My first International Coordinating Committee meeting exceeded all expectations. The conference room at Interpol headquarters was filled with senior investigators from countries I'd only read about in intelligence reports. Chief Inspector Williams from London, Commissioner Dubois from France, Inspector Chen from Singapore, Detective Superintendent Kumar from India, all of them dealing with the same cryptocurrency-enabled crimes that our task force had been investigating. "The challenge we face," explained Secretary General Morrison during the opening session, "is that criminal organizations are operating globally, while law enforcement remains largely organized along national and regional lines. We need frameworks that allow us to respond to threats that transcend traditional jurisdictional boundaries." The three-day conference focused on developing protocols for sharing intelligence, coordinating operations, and harmonizing legal frameworks across different countries. Much of the discussion centered on technical challenges: how to trace cryptocurrency transactions across international exchanges, how to obtain evidence from digital service providers in different legal systems, how to protect sources and methods, while enabling effective cooperation. But the most valuable conversations happened during informal discussions between sessions, when investigators shared specific case experiences and developed personal relationships that would facilitate future cooperation. I found myself explaining American legal procedures to colleagues who were unfamiliar with our constitutional requirements, while learning about investigative techniques that had been developed in other countries. Inspector Chen described how Singapore's Financial Intelligence Unit had developed algorithms that could identify suspicious cryptocurrency transaction patterns in real time. "We can detect potential money laundering within hours rather than months," she explained. "But we need partnerships with other countries to act on that intelligence effectively." Detective Superintendent Kumar outlined how Indian investigators had penetrated cryptocurrency-enabled human trafficking networks by analyzing social media communications alongside financial transactions. "The criminals use the same digital platforms for recruitment, coordination, and financial transfers," he said. "Understanding the social networks helps us map the financial flows." Those insights directly influenced how our American task force approached subsequent investigation. We began incorporating social media analysis into our financial investigations, and we developed real-time monitoring capabilities similar to those used in Singapore. The international assignment also provided perspective on how American law enforcement compared to our global counterpart. Our legal framework was more restrictive in some ways, requiring higher standards for surveillance and evidence collection, but also more sophisticated in terms of technical capabilities and interagency coordination. "The FBI's approach to financial crime investigation is remarkably advanced," commented Chief Inspector Williams during one session. "Your ability to integrate intelligence from multiple agencies and coordinate operations across vast geographic areas is something we're trying to emulate. But I also recognized areas where international partners were ahead of American law enforcement. European investigators had developed more sophisticated approaches to victim services and criminal asset recovery. Asian law enforcement agencies were more advanced in cryptocurrency technical analysis. African investigators had extensive experience with cross-border organized crime networks. The international collaboration was producing tangible results within months. A cryptocurrency laundering network that our task force had been tracking was connected to drug trafficking operations that European investigators were monitoring. By sharing intelligence and coordinating operations, we were able to disrupt criminal enterprises that neither American nor European law enforcement could have addressed independently. The joint operation, codenamed Digital Silk Road, resulted in arrests in 8 countries and the seizure of over $12 million in cryptocurrency and traditional assets. More importantly, it demonstrated that international cooperation could be both effective and efficient when properly organized and coordinated. "This operation shows what's possible when we think beyond national boundaries," Director Gomez said during the post-operation brief. "Criminal organizations that operate globally require law enforcement responses that are equally global in scope and coordination." The success of Digital Silk Road led to additional international assignments and increasing recognition within both American and international law enforcement community. I was invited to join a United Nations working group on transnational organized crime, serve on an advisory committee for the World Bank's anti-money laundering initiatives, and participate in academic conferences focused on the intersection of technology and criminal justice. Each opportunity built on previous experiences, while opening doors to new challenges and responsibilities. The path from line agent to international coordinator had been neither planned nor predictable, but each step had followed logically from the previous one, based on demonstrated competence and expanding expertise. The personal satisfaction came not from the titles or recognition, but from the knowledge that the work was making a real difference. Every criminal network we disrupted meant fewer victims of trafficking, fraud, or exploitation. Every investigative technique we developed and shared meant other law enforcement agencies could protect more people more effectively. By spring, our international task force had established permanent working relationships with law enforcement agencies in 34 countries. We developed standardized protocols for cryptocurrency investigation that were being used by hundreds of investigators worldwide. Most importantly, we demonstrated that technical crimes like cryptocurrency fraud were often components of much larger criminal enterprises that required sophisticated, coordinated responses. The work had evolved far beyond anything I'd imagined when I first joined the FBI. Instead of investigating individual cases in a single field office, I was helping to build global systems for detecting and disrupting transnational criminal organizations. Instead of protecting hundreds of victims, our methods were being used to protect thousands of people across multiple continents. The scope of impact was extraordinary, but it had also required sacrificing some of the direct personal elements of law enforcement work that had originally attracted me to the profession. I rarely interviewed witnesses or victims anymore, rarely participated in arrest or evidence collection. My work had become more strategic and systematic, focused on building capabilities rather than solving individual cases. The trade-off was worth it, but it required a fundamental shift in how I thought about professional satisfaction and career success. The work was less immediately tangible, but ultimately more impactful. Instead of measuring success by individual cases closed, I was measuring it by systems built and capabilities developed. That perspective was tested during a particularly challenging case in late spring, when our task force identified a cryptocurrency-enabled trafficking network that was exploiting children across multiple states. The financial intelligence was clear and compelling, but the operational response required coordination between state and federal agencies that had different priorities and procedures. Agent Martinez led the victim rescue coordination, working with social services agencies in 6 states to ensure that children were safely removed from exploitative situations and provided with appropriate care. The complexity of managing multiple jurisdictions, while prioritizing victim safety over evidence collection, tested every system we'd developed for interagency cooperation. These cases remind us why we do this work, Sarah said, during one of our late-night coordination calls. Every technical analysis, every financial trace, every international intelligence sharing agreement, it all comes down to protecting people who can't protect themselves. The operation was ultimately successful, resulting in 37 arrests and the rescue of 43 children. But the emotional weight of the case was more intense than anything I'd experienced as a line agent. Leading a team that was responsible for so many vulnerable victims created pressure and responsibility that individual casework had never involved. The experience reinforced my understanding that career progression in law enforcement meant accepting increasing responsibility for outcomes that affected more people in more profound ways. The work became less about personal achievement and more about building systems and leading teams that could protect people on a scale that no individual agent could achieve alone. As summer approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me from Marcus's humiliation at Dad's funeral to international recognition as an expert on transnational financial crime. The professional growth had been remarkable, but the personal growth had been equally significant. I'd learned to measure my worth by my own standards, rather than by family expectations. I discovered that professional success came from aligning my work with my values and abilities, rather than from seeking approval from people who didn't understand my choices. Most importantly, I'd realized that the most meaningful careers are often those that require leaving behind familiar environments and comfortable assumptions in pursuit of work that matches your potential rather than your past. The call from the Secretary of Homeland Security came on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 2 years after Dad's funeral. I was reviewing intelligence reports in my office when Assistant Director Gomez knocked on my door,
her expression carrying the kind of gravity that suggested something significant was about to happen. "Zoe, Secretary Davis wants to speak with you personally," she said, gesturing toward the secure phone on my desk. "The White House has been briefed on your international task force work." My conversation with Secretary Davis lasted 45 minutes, covering everything from the digital Silk Road operation to the victim rescue protocols we'd developed for cryptocurrency-enabled trafficking cases. She spoke with the precise efficiency of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected national policy, asking pointed questions about scalability, resource requirements, and measurable outcomes. "Agent Harper," she said near the end of our conversation, "we're creating a new position within the Department of Homeland Security, Director of Digital Financial Crime Coordination. The role would involve overseeing cryptocurrency crime prevention across all federal agencies, while maintaining your international cooperation responsibilities." The position represented another quantum leap in responsibility and influence. Instead of leading a single task force within the FBI, I would be coordinating digital financial crime policy across the entire federal government, while serving as America's primary liaison with international law enforcement agencies. "The position comes with a significant challenge," Secretary Davis continued. "Congress is demanding results on cryptocurrency crime prevention, but they're also skeptical about new bureaucratic structure. You'd need to demonstrate measurable impact within your first year while building sustainable systems for long-term effectiveness." I accepted the position that afternoon, recognizing it as the natural evolution of work I'd been developing for 3 years. The role would allow me to implement cryptocurrency crime prevention strategies at a scale that could actually keep pace with the rapidly evolving threat landscape. The transition period was intense, but exhilarating. My new office was located in the DHS headquarters building in Washington, with a staff of analysts, coordinators, and technical specialists drawn from agencies across the federal government. The budget was substantial enough to fund major technological initiatives and international cooperation programs. My first major initiative focused on developing real-time cryptocurrency monitoring systems that could identify suspicious transaction patterns as they occurred rather than weeks or months later. Working with the Treasury Department's Financial Intelligence Unit and the National Security Agency's technical specialists, we created algorithms that could analyze blockchain transactions in real time while protecting privacy rights and civil liberty. "The system we're building," I explained to a joint congressional committee during my first oversight hearing, "will function like radar for financial crime. Instead of investigating cryptocurrency fraud after victims have been harmed, we'll be able to detect criminal patterns early enough to prevent most of the damage." The technical implementation required partnerships with private cryptocurrency exchanges, wallet services, and blockchain analysis companies. Many of these businesses had been reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement in the past, viewing government oversight as a threat to the innovation and privacy that made digital assets attractive to legitimate users. Convincing them to participate required demonstrating that our monitoring systems would enhance rather than undermine the legitimate cryptocurrency ecosystem. We developed protocols that protected user privacy while flagging genuinely suspicious activities, and we shared intelligence that helped exchanges identify and remove criminal users from their platform. The first major test of our new systems came 6 months after implementation, when our algorithms detected a coordinated cryptocurrency fraud targeting military veterans. The pattern recognition software identified suspicious wallet addresses that were receiving payments from multiple victims, using similar transaction amounts and timing patterns. Within hours of detection, we had coordinated responses from the FBI, Secret Service, and state law enforcement agencies in 12 states. The rapid response prevented additional victims from losing money while allowing us to trace funds that had already been stolen and arrest the criminals before they could disappear with their proceeds. Traditional investigation of this fraud would have taken months and allowed the criminals to steal millions more dollars, Agent Chen reported during our post-operation analysis. Real-time detection and response prevented an estimated $8 million in additional losses, while enabling us to recover funds for victims who had already been defrauded. The success generated immediate attention from both law enforcement and policy community. Other countries began requesting technical assistance to implement similar monitoring systems, while Congress increased funding for digital financial crime prevention initiatives. but the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Marcus called on a Saturday evening, his voice filled with something I'd never heard from him before, genuine awe and respect for work he actually understood. "Zoe, I saw the news coverage about that military veteran case," he said. "They interviewed some of the victims you helped, talked about how your system saved their retirement money. One guy said you probably saved his house, his whole family's future." The conversation continued for over an hour, with Marcus asking detailed questions about how the monitoring systems worked and expressing amazement at the scope of the criminal networks we were disrupting. It was the kind of conversation I'd always hoped to have with my family, one where they saw my work as something valuable and heroic, rather than as academic abstraction. "Dad would have been blown away by this," Marcus said toward the end of our call. "He always respected people who protected working families from getting ripped off. He just never understood, that's what you were doing." That comment stayed with me for days afterward. Dad had spent his career fixing cars for working families in Millfield, taking pride in providing honest service at fair prices. He'd seen his work as protecting people from unscrupulous mechanics who might overcharge or perform unnecessary repair. My work was fundamentally similar, protecting vulnerable people from criminals who would exploit their trust, but the technical complexity had made the connection invisible to him. The irony was that my career had been motivated by the same values Dad had tried to instill in me: integrity, service to others, and protection of people who couldn't protect themselves. The difference was that I'd found ways to apply those values on a much larger scale, using education and technology to magnify the impact of individual effort. The international aspects of my work continued expanding throughout the year. The success of our real-time monitoring systems generated requests for technical assistance from law enforcement agencies in over 40 countries. We developed training programs that taught investigators around the world to implement similar capabilities, while adapting our methods to different legal frameworks and technological infrastructures. The global cooperation produced remarkable results. A cryptocurrency laundering network that we detected through our monitoring systems was simultaneously disrupted by coordinated operations in 15 countries, resulting in over 100 arrests and the recovery of nearly $50 million in criminal proceeds. This operation demonstrates the potential for global law enforcement cooperation when we have the right tools and frameworks, I told the International Association of Financial Crime Investigators during their annual conference. Technology that enables criminals to operate globally can also enable law enforcement to respond globally. The speech was covered by international media outlets and generated invitations to brief government officials and law enforcement leaders around the world. I found myself traveling regularly to countries I'd only read about, sharing American expertise while learning from international colleagues who had developed innovative approaches to similar challenges. But the most satisfying aspect of the international work was seeing how our methods were being adapted and improved by investigators in different contexts. European investigators had developed enhanced victim identification protocols based on our trafficking case methodology. Asian law enforcement agencies had created more sophisticated blockchain analysis tools using our algorithmic approaches. African investigators had pioneered community-based prevention programs that complemented our technical detection system. The global exchange of ideas and methods was producing law enforcement capabilities that no single country could have developed independently. Each international partnership made our collective response to transnational crime more effective and comprehensive. As my second year in the DHS position drew to a close, I received an invitation that represented the culmination of everything I'd worked toward. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime asked me to serve as the keynote speaker for their global conference on transnational organized crime, addressing an audience of law enforcement leaders, policymakers, and academic experts from over 100 countries. The speech took months to prepare, not because the content was difficult to develop, but because I wanted to capture the full scope of what we'd accomplished while providing a roadmap for future progress. The talk was titled "From Digital Breadcrumbs to Global Protection: Technology as a Force Multiplier for Victim-Centered Law Enforcement." Standing at the podium in the UN headquarters in New York, looking out at an audience that included some of the world's most respected law enforcement professionals, I felt the weight of how far I'd traveled from that humiliating moment at Dad's funeral 3 years earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, 3 years ago, sophisticated criminals were using emerging technologies to exploit vulnerable people, while law enforcement struggled to understand the tools being used against us. Today, we've not only caught up with criminal innovation, we've moved ahead of it. I described how our international task force had evolved from a small team investigating individual cases to a global network that prevented crimes before they occurred. I outlined the victim rescue operations that had freed hundreds of people from trafficking and exploitation. I shared statistics showing how our methods had prevented billions of dollars in fraud while enabling the recovery of funds for thousands of victims. But our greatest achievement, I continued, hasn't been the technology we've developed or the criminals we've arrested.
Our greatest achievement has been proving that law enforcement can evolve as rapidly as the threats we face, that international cooperation can be both effective and respectful of national sovereignty, and that victim protection can be the organizing principle for everything we do. The speech received a standing ovation, but more importantly, it generated commitments from dozens of countries to implement similar victim-centered approaches to transnational crime. Representatives from the European Union, African Union, and Association of Southeast Asian Nations all requested technical assistance to develop regional versions of our monitoring and cooperation systems. The UN conference was followed by a series of bilateral meetings with law enforcement leaders who wanted to discuss specific cooperation agreements and technology sharing arrangements. By the end of the week, we had established formal partnerships that would extend our global crime prevention network to regions that had previously been beyond our reach. Flying back to Washington, I reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in just 3 years. The humiliation at Dad's funeral had forced me to confront fundamental questions about family loyalty, professional purpose, and personal work. The journey from that low point to international recognition had required letting go of the need for family approval, while discovering sources of validation that were based on competence and contribution, rather than obligation and expectation. The airplane's window offered a view of the American coastline emerging from darkness into dawn, and I found myself thinking about all the victims whose lives had been changed by the work we'd accomplished. Elderly people who'd kept their retirement savings, children who'd been rescued from trafficking, military veterans who'd avoided investment fraud, thousands of people who were living better lives because of systems we'd built and criminals we'd stopped. That impact mattered more than any family approval or professional recognition. The work itself had become the source of meaning and satisfaction, independent of external validation or personal acclaim. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Patterson, who had just graduated from the FBI Academy and been assigned to the Financial Crimes Division. Just wanted to let you know I start my first cryptocurrency case tomorrow. Everything I learned from our mentoring conversations is about to be put to the test. Thank you for showing me this path was possible. The message reminded me that the work we'd done was creating opportunities for the next generation of law enforcement professionals. Young agents like Sarah would inherit investigative tools and international partnerships that would allow them to protect people in ways that hadn't been possible when I'd started my career. The cycle of mentorship and professional development was perhaps the most important legacy of everything we'd accomplished. Individual cases and specific investigations would eventually be forgotten, but the capabilities we'd built and the people we'd trained would continue protecting vulnerable populations long after I'd moved on to other challenges. Landing at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, I realized that the question Marcus had asked at Dad's funeral, whether my work was really as important as Agent Kane had claimed, now had a definitive answer. The importance wasn't measured by titles or recognition, but by the lives that had been protected and the systems that had been built to continue that protection. The little girl from Millfield who'd been told she was too ambitious, too educated, too independent for her own good, had become exactly who she was meant to be, not despite her family's limitations, but by transcending them while maintaining the core values they'd actually taught her: integrity, service to others, and protection of people who needed help. The work continued, as it always. Criminals would develop new technologies and exploitation methods, requiring law enforcement to adapt and evolve in response. But we'd proven that adaptation was possible, that international cooperation could be effective, and that victim protection could guide everything we did. Standing in the airport terminal, surrounded by travelers heading home to families and communities across the country, I felt a profound sense of purpose and peace. The path from that cemetery confrontation to this moment had been neither straight nor predictable, but every step had built toward work that mattered in ways I'd never imagined possible. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, and new opportunities to protect people from sophisticated criminals. But tonight, for the first time since Dad's funeral, I felt completely aligned with who I was and what I was doing with my life. The best revenge I'd learned wasn't proving your critics wrong, it was becoming exactly who you were capable of being, with or without their understanding or approval. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.